outreach activities here at the Institute of Middle East Studies at the George Washington University. We're very excited to be hosting this special IMAS event with the Ana Masry Foundation, the role of Egyptians in the U.S. in building a stronger community and a stronger Egypt, a panel discussion and brainstorming session. This forum hopes to add to the debate on how the Egyptian American community can contribute to Egypt's transition and sustainable development. Our moderator this evening is Nihal Elwan. She is an anthropologist and international development practitioner working on social and human development in the Middle East, North Africa region with a focus on Egypt. For the past 9 years, Nihal has worked with a multitude of international development organizations, donors, and civil society organizations in the region. She is a member of the Ana Masry Foundation and has been in the U.S. for a little under 2 years. I'm going to turn this over now to Nihal. Nihal?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Well, first of all, I'd like to start by thanking everybody for joining us in today's event. And just by looking at this room and sensing the energy, it's a wonderful indication of the interest, the dynamism that exists amongst members of the Egyptian community here, and the desire to do something to hopefully support Egypt in these sort of trying times. I would also like to thank George Washington University for hosting this event and for the efforts that everybody has done to help us today. I would also like to introduce our distinguished panelists today. To my immediate right, we have Sahar Taman. Sahar Taman is a co-founder of Journeys to Understanding and has directed the Religion and Society Dialogue program at the National Peace Foundation, where she has developed a program to foster dialogue between the Arabic-speaking Middle East and American religious communities, Ms. Taman has led several programs in Egypt before and after the 2011 revolution, which aim to address Muslim-Christian relations, and has received a number of distinguished awards for her work. She's also the editor of Reflections and Experiences of Religion and Society 2010, a compendium of essays from writers who describe their personal transformation from interfaith experiences. Next, we have Mr. Sherif Fhmy. Sherif grew up in Cairo and has come to the United States with his family as a middle schooler. He studied engineering and physics at Princeton University and is currently completing his PhD in engineering at Northwestern University, Chicago. Sherif is passionate about tech entrepreneurship and philosophy of science. He also enjoys hobbies in music, photography, and writing. He has co-founded the Alliance for a Democratic Egypt in January 2011 after the bombing of the All Saints Church in Alexandria and shortly prior to the January 25th revolution. And next we have Mr. Randa Fhmy. She has more than 25 years of legal and public policy experience, including service in the executive and legislative branches of the United States government. She is currently president of Hudome International and serves as vice president of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association and general counsel for the American Egyptian Strategic Alliance. Ms. Fhmy was previously appointed as the Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy. And finally, we have Mr. Khaled Gindy, who is the founding board member of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association and is a visiting fellow with the Saban Center for the Middle East Policy at Brookings. He has recently served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah and spent 9 years in various political and policy-related positions in Washington, D.C., both inside and outside of the federal government. Mr. Gindy holds an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University and a BA in Political Science from Indiana University. So, before we start, I just want to share with you a little story. I've just come back from Egypt myself, only about 3 days ago. And the reason I went was partially because I was feeling quite anxious about the situation in Egypt, because the news coming out was a little disconcerting over the past 2-3 months. But also because I wanted to sort of get a sense of what Egyptians in Egypt are doing right now, what initiatives are taking place, what is happening. So I met with a lot of friends and ex-colleagues. But through every single conversation, the one question that kept popping up to me was, they kept asking me, so what are Egyptians in the US doing? What are you guys doing to try and help us? And while my knee-jerk reaction was, we're very concerned and we really want to help, felt that I should have a much more concrete answer and be able to say something about how we are organizing ourselves here. But I'm afraid I realized that I'm not sure what Egyptians in America are doing. And I think this is the main reason behind this session that we're having today. A, to get to know one another and to get to know what Egyptian organizations in the US are doing, which is what we're going to learn from our distinguished panelists today, but also perhaps to leave with a sense of inspiration, to leave with a sense that, yeah, this is a cause that I'm interested in. This is an effort I would like to join. It would be great if each and every one of us could leave this room today feeling that this is an issue or a cause I would like to volunteer in. And hopefully this is what we're going to leave this room with. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to my distinguished panelists and start with Ms. Sahar Taman, who will tell us a little bit about the wonderful work that she does. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Nihal. I'm Sahar Taman, Fhmy Alif Noon, the unusual Arabic name, but we are Egyptian. And I want to thank the George Washington Institute for Middle Eastern Studies and Ana Masry, and to my distinguished colleagues, and to be invited onto the panel, and for many of you that I know and people who are coming out on a Monday night. That's the beginning of spring. I'm going to basically take through a little bit about the importance of what I think is, the most important effort that needs to be done, and I'll speak into the mic, that needs to be done in Egypt. And I call it Muslim Coptic relations, what needs to be done, neighbors, building Egypt together. Why address Muslim Coptic relations? Very slow. In Egypt, religion has played and will play a major role and central role in daily life and in government, and that's not going to go away. The religious identity should not be disregarded in favor of national identity in Egypt. We are going to be Christians and Muslims and Egyptian Jews. Through the religious identity, this is where social unity is going to be promoted, through our identity. And civil society, whether it's religious or not, it must be encouraged to conduct social service and joint projects together with IFD. IFD is Interfaith Dialogue, high on their agenda. However, more than that, why do work on interfaith dialogues? Because the 2011 Egyptian revolution started on December 31st, 2010, and that was the bombing of the Church of Two Saints in Alexandria. If you look at this icon, which many of us are now familiar with, this crescent and cross, this actually has January 7th, 2011 on it. This was pre-revolution. And this is something I found on the internet at that time. Here's another icon. I don't actually know if it's from the Ana Masry. Is it from the Ana Masry? This is another one. Ana Masry did that have on Egyptian against terrorism. This picture is happened after, immediately after the bombing of the Church of Two Saints. So what happened in Egypt had a lot to do, the revolution had a lot to do with people not accepting the social norms that have happened there. This is a picture that came out from Tahrir Square, another example of what is very, very possible that has not happened recently. So in the chapter in Unity and Diversity, Interfaith Dialogue in the Middle East, co-authored by Muhammad Abu Nim, which is a USIP, United States Institute publication. There's a chapter from 2007, Interfaith Dialogue in Egypt. What went wrong? What were the obstacles? And I'm going to take a real look at what happened before the revolution and post-revolution. 4 obstacles. Over-politicization of dialogue efforts. Dialogue was seen as a national security issue, seen as sectarian divisiveness, encouraging an identity separate from being Egyptian. We are all Egyptian. This course was only about this national unity, and there were several negative forces. The radicalism, the outside groups focusing on discrimination, only as discrimination, and the religious freedom efforts coming from the United States. That's huge pressure. What has changed? Unfortunately, most of this is the same, except the national security concern has been replaced with, okay, now Egypt has other priorities. We can't focus on Muslim-Coptic dialogue at this time. The other obstacle has been suspicion surrounding the dialogue efforts that lead to separation. So Christians and Muslims live in separate lives socially. The motivations behind any dialogue, what happened, why are they doing this? Religious institutions in the past have taken on, are not only social service, they're social centers, sports, NADI, everybody's everything in the church or the mosque. Now, in the revolution, there's a recognition by some Christians that they have been insular, I've heard this myself, and isolated, and they've been not fully participating in society. So there's a change. There's also a recognition by some Muslims, specifically the Salafi, I don't know if they're just self-described as Salafi, I know some Salafis, they say the same thing. We have been isolated and living in our own world. So there is a movement, a possibility. However, what's most positive is what was the deficiency of grassroots initiative, which we all know about. Lack of cultural and education and social work, lack of serious grassroots activism, lack of volunteerism. This has changed. I believe it has changed. I think many of us believe it has changed, and I don't think it's going to go away. We're proof of it here. The next issue, the last one, was a lack of a clear vision for dialogue. And this is, I think, the action item. Before the revolution, the dialogue didn't move beyond what is a dialogue and what is involved. It was very stilted, it was very surface. Very good intention, sometimes, where it happened, where it was allowed to happen, but very few objectives. Post-revolution, Egyptians are invested in building Egypt. There is a publication, we can talk about it later, that just came out about the Egyptian Coptic community in the diaspora. And very well done, I think George Washington University study. Among it, it says among the most important factors that it identifies is that Egyptian Coptic community in the diaspora identifies with Egypt's future. Very concerned, 95% feel that they are invested in Egypt's future. But post-revolution, we also can go beyond interfaith dialogue to work as neighbors to build Egypt via the grassroots. So what are the grassroots best practices? So this is a dialogue. First, you can start with a dialogue to learn and understand. There really does need to be dialogue. The Muslims have too scant a knowledge of Christianity, specifically Coptic Christianity. And as a Muslim myself, I definitely can say this. This does not, this cuts across all classes. Muslims from upper middle class, lower middle class, very rarely know enough about Christianity except to say, oh, in the Quran, we have an entire chapter, Surah Maryam, with Maryam, a whole chapter on Mary, or references like simplistic identification of what is Christianity. There's also a lot of suspicions among the Coptic community. Still, I actually heard someone say, well, now that the Salafi have come out, they've come out to the open, we have to know where the other people, those are the people who have in their hearts, they're the ones still holding this, the antagonism towards us. So there's still a suspicion there. However, the dialogue has to happen to learn and understand. Then there has to be indigenization, that the concepts and the theoretical framing that must come out must be Egyptian in culture and experience. Egyptians in Egypt share everything, but pretty much the faith. They're very common culture. We have very much in common. However, we can borrow. What is it that Egyptian Americans can do? We can borrow and show what we have learned outside of Egypt. And that is this concept of faith-based grassroots activism. So everything here that is faith-based, there's a faith-based many, many things, but among them, like Muslim-Christian neighborhood planning, Muslim-Christian environmentalism, Muslim-Christian merchants association. From these efforts, we can talk about lifting institutional discrimination, among the other things, as well as building Egypt. Here's a final example of, you see these images, and this girl is a very serious image, and I'm really very moved at this, as much as I am moved by so many other of the events that happened. I do want to talk about money for 1 second. Just wanted to point out that Egypt, we're talking about money and where we're going to do projects. Egypt, and this is a World Bank, is among the top 10 recipients of remittances from the Egyptian community. Top 10, $7.7 billion. So if we're not sending money from NGOs, Egyptians are sending money. So there's a lot of potential for what can be done for projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sahar, for this wonderful and moving presentation. Sherif?
Hi everyone, my name is Sherif Fhmy, and I'm a co-founder of the Alliance for Democratic Egypt. I'll tell you about AllForEgypt in a minute. But first I want to thank Ana Masry for organizing this really important dialogue, and I want to thank the other panelists for sharing their insight, and also for the great work they all have been doing. So I'm really looking forward to a productive discussion tonight towards actionable steps for having real impact as a community of Egyptian Americans. So around the time of the uprising about a year ago, there was a lot of pessimism in the air. There was also a great deal of optimism in the air. I forgot to open my slides. So there was also pessimism and optimism, and I feel like the optimists turned out to be wrong, and so did the pessimists, and here is why. Optimism and pessimism are nothing but forecasts based on feeling. They're both predictive states of mind, and the minute you start to predict is the minute you've removed yourself from the equation. You start to discount the possibility that you can have some real impact as to Egypt's fate, in exchange for the assumption that this fate is all but fully determined. So it is neither the optimist nor the pessimist who has positive impact. It is not the realist either. It is the activist, hopefully not the opportunist. So we all know that if we're going to have any real impact, then we have to get fully invested and get our hands dirty. But one thing I've heard recently, can we really have impact from abroad? Some people say we can't. But let's jog our memory with a few examples. Do you recall a gentleman by the name of Hudome? Or what about journalist Ana Masry? Let me ask you a different kind of example. Do you feel that the Salafis or Muslim Brotherhood have overseas supporters, and are these supporters having some type of impact on the current state of Egypt? Finally, consider IPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, whether it has impact overseas in the Middle East. So the question is not whether it is possible to have impact from overseas, but what kind of impact we want to have, and what is it going to take. Let's, for the moment, focus only on democratization as the desired outcome. That's what our group is mainly focused on. If any impact is to be had from overseas, there are 3 primary channels through which we may act. And I believe each group or effort should probably be focused only on one of these. The first is through U.S. foreign policy toward Egypt. But U.S. foreign policy is driven by a complex set of incentives, and it is not easily influenced. So we have to think pretty strategically on how to navigate that. The second is through support of liberal pro-democracy activists and civil society organizations that have complementary goals. This requires quite a bit of capital and other resources, especially if we wish to support them to a level where they can become really influential. The third is through trying to establish programs that directly attempt to educate and influence the Egyptian public to join the pro-democracy side of the ideological table. This will require resources as well as active, ongoing collaborations with pro-democracy influencers on the ground in Egypt. I feel that many of us who want to help still need to nail down a strategy for utilizing one of these channels, because they all present really massive hurdles. And if we're going to have the real impact, I feel that it's imperative to achieve 3 important criteria: coordination, strategy, and effort, in that order. So first I'll talk quickly about coordination. Since the uprising, at least dozens of groups sprouted up across the U.S. wanting to be involved in Egypt. That is actually a positive sign, However, we remain in a state of coordination failure. What I believe needs to happen is that these groups need to talk to each other. So there's been talk about having some kind of online hub or directory of all kinds of efforts and needs and wants and activities and such things. And I feel that's necessary, but is by no means sufficient. I feel what really is needed is a face-to-face dialogue to be able to coordinate and consolidate efforts. What I would propose for a first step would be something like a one-day meeting with very few talks, probably no talks, and with pre-selected groups of people who can get together in working groups, come up with just the high-level objectives, not really brainstorming, but just within the high-level objectives, who can be involved in what, and how can we consolidate the effort. So the bottom line for me is that there needs to be fewer groups. Each of these needs to grow in size and influence and resource. Now, on to strategy. We all know loosely what a strategy is, but I think it's worthwhile to talk about it for a moment. It's knowing whom or what you're going after and why. It's also knowing what is the best way to get to it or them. Strategy is not your plan of action, though. Rather, it's knowing in detail what you're up against before you start to plan. So it needs real data. Here's what I mean. If your objective involves something like U.S. foreign policy, you'd better be looking at real data and historical precedent to understand how this foreign policy machine works and to understand how it can go into it. That's as one example. As another example, if we're going to try to educate the Egyptian public about democracy, then we have to really know who our audience is, beyond conjecture, to have real data about our audience. More importantly, to find 10 to 20 people from our target audience, talk to them one-on-one and get a better feel for how they think. That's how we can start to think about real strategy based on real data. And I feel strategy is also knowing what measurable outcomes we will go after, at least initially. And I would emphasize the word measurable. If we haven't identified some desired outcome and a way to measure it, then I wouldn't even start on a project, because I feel we're not ever going to have long-term impact unless we've thought about how to measure our short-term effectiveness. So the last element that I mentioned was effort, and I'll talk about that in context of our group, the Alliance for Democratic Egypt, AllForEgypt.org. It's just a volunteer group. It's not really an organization. Basically, we had, around the time of the revolution, about 30 people said they wanted to be involved. Most of them got involved by referral. They were all very capable and talented people. They were all very excited, and they all promised some really major contributions as part of the effort. So we got really excited, and we tried to seek support. So we sought support from people like Monal Tahawi, Professor Sherif at DePaul in Chicago, actor and director Khaled Ihab Abdu, and others whom he's put us in touch with, and all have shown willingness to support us. Then there came time to present some deliverables, some proposals, some initial work, and they weren't coming in time. Back in February, March, people who got involved were super excited, and I was going into this effort, and my co-founders, the initial core group, were going into it with the long-term focus, knowing that this is going to be a long-term project. However, when the time came for the actual work, tedious work to be done, a lot of it wasn't coming in. So it really, instead of a group of 30, what it was a group of about 4. So we had to narrow down our project. And to tell you about what our focus is really quickly, we basically got together and said, we want to identify what are the minimal, simplest principles that are necessary to establish a true democracy and to get people in Egypt talking about them. So we're going to do that by producing written content and video content. And we would think of ways, then we would strategize about how to disseminate that content to the right audiences and get people really talking about these things and talking about the substance. And instead of bickering back and forth about who's going to rule and what's going to happen. So in the end, what I'd like to emphasize is this sort of thing, like our project, which is focused on educating people about democracy, or at least promoting dialogue about democracy. That's, to me, a 30 to 50 year effort. And that's how I go into it thinking about it. So any effort like that we try to start, we have to be in it for the long term, and we have to be willing to work in a timely manner and deliver. Basically what I say is no work, no task is below us, basically. Whatever needs to be done, we need to do. And that especially, I say this especially to any effort that's going to be a volunteer effort. It's different when it's your job. When it's not your job, you have to be truly invested in it. That's what I have. And I would love for you to visit our website. Click to get involved link. We are definitely looking for more people to get involved, but we're looking for people who are committed, not just who are riding the Egypt bandwagon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sherif, for this very dynamic presentation. I think it's good for us to always keep in mind that when we sink our teeth into volunteering, the momentum shouldn't fizzle out all too quickly. We should keep the stamina going. And now we leave the floor to Randa.
I am not going to have a PowerPoint presentation, but I do have a laptop because I'm old and I can't see anything, and I have a 16 point, so bear with me here. Well, thank you. This evening I'd like to talk a little bit about the background of the new organization that some of us have formed in the Egyptian American community. It's called the American Egyptian Strategic Alliance. And the background actually starts, I think, where everyone has something in common, which is the revolution. All of my family are still in Egypt, and I, like many of you, my only connection to when the revolution started was really television. The day that it started, it became apparent that there was something real going on there. I, like many of you, I'm sure, were glued to the television. And it was my sort of smart American husband who said, stop watching American networks, turn to Al Jazeera. And that's where I certainly got my news feed from, as well as Facebook. And Facebook actually became my method of communicating with my cousins on the ground, who were all on Facebook together. And when the internet was working, I could get news. You know, how's uncle, how's auntie, how's everybody doing? And I'm sure we all shared that experience. But then something more hit us. Like Sherif said, what can we do? What can we do to help them after we saw that things were somewhat successful? Now, on March 19th, many of you know the Ana Masry Foundation, and thank you to them for sponsoring this tonight, but they were one of the sponsors of a conference held at Georgetown University. And I'm going to be all honest with you, because I'm sure you're all friends here. I almost didn't go. And you want to know why I almost didn't go? Because I have a career in Arab American politics. And my experience with Arab American politics and conferences is there's a lot of coffee drinking, there's a lot of smoking outside, there's a lot of yelling and screaming and disagreement, and absolutely nothing gets done. So a friend of mine, who shall remain nameless, said, you know, just go. And in the last minute I went. And I have to tell you, I am so pleased that I went. The first thing I did when I sat down, I sat right next to Mimi. Is that right?
Yeah.
Mimi and I sat next to each other, didn't know each other. There were probably about 150 people in there, and by the end of the day, everybody knew everybody else, and everybody had something in common. And it's been a friendship that has lasted since then.
Thank you.
Many plans were hatched that day. Many real plans were hatched that day. One of them was this idea that we as Egyptian Americans could actually vote in the election. And guess what? We did it. May not be perfect, but we did it. Okay, another idea that came forth was this database that you were talking about, this idea of creating a database, and I know there are people that are working on that. But one of the ideas that I was most excited about, as somebody who's been involved, I said, in Arab American politics, was a lobbying organization. Now, my experience is I used to work for the oldest and greatest Arab American lobbying organization that no longer exists, I'm sorry to say. It was called the National Association of Arab Americans. It was founded in the 1970s and served a heyday in the 1980s. Their biggest accomplishments, many of you may not remember this, but one of their biggest accomplishments was lobbying in favor of AWACS, which were planes in the late 80s that the Saudis actually wanted to buy. Through the 90s, the organization diminished, and I was working at that organization in the 90s. And our primary focus at that time was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So while I was working at that lobbying organization, I was the only lobbyist lobbying on behalf of interests of Arab Americans, both domestic and foreign policy. But the foreign policy issue was the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and I actually lobbied on the Oslo Accords. But I also saw other Arab American lobbying organizations spring up. One of them was the American Task Force for Lebanon, which to this day not only exists, but hands down is probably one of the most effective lobbying organizations that lobbies on what? one country and one country only, and that's Lebanon, the interests of U.S.-Lebanon relationship. I also saw and witnessed the founding of the American Task Force for Palestine, which again has become, I think they're in their 9th year now, one of the more successful organizations. And guess what they lobby on? One issue and one issue only, Palestine. So what was my conclusion? By God, we Egyptian Americans have the right and the biggest reason to form our own organization, because honestly, it's the only way we're going to be effective. Now, a few of us got together. I'll talk a little process and then I'll talk substance. We got together, we decided on a name. Now, where did this name come from? I have to say that I was a little bit behind the name, because it's very important what we named it. It is our introduction to the American society and American politics. And so we are Americans first. The name of the organization is the American Egyptian Strategic Alliance. We named it that to signify the strategic alliance between America and Egypt. There is no more important alliance in the Middle East today than the United States and Egypt, bar none. And it's an alliance, one that needs to remain strong. We actually registered it as a 501c4 nonprofit organization. For those of you that may not know the tax code, what that means is we're a lobbying organization. Yes? Say it again. We are not a nonprofit charitable organization, although we will form our sister organization. This is a real live lobbying organization, and for those of you who don't like the word lobbying, you can use the French word for lawyer, and that's avocat. You can say we're an advocacy organization if that makes you feel better. We have formed a transitional board of directors, of which I serve as the general counsel. We have Amin Mahmoud, who's also on our transitional board here with us. I don't know if anyone else is here tonight. But we are transitional. We are willing to create our permanent board of directors once we bring more leaders on board. We've opened up our offices downtown at 1100 Connecticut Avenue, Connecticut, Nihal. We've created our bylaws. We're developing a communication plan. And we've reached out to the community. And I have to say, one of the first people that reached back is our beloved Dr. Ibrahim Awais. When the first email went out announcing the organization, he was the first responder who said, I will do anything I want. Since then, of course, I've met Clarat Aburea, who also has offered to be a founding member. And we're getting right now financial support. Because I will tell you this now, I know people don't like to talk about finances and money, but the reality is a lobbying organization like this will not have power and will not be able to function without financial support. So the good news is there are a few of us who have contributed financially, and there are more that is coming in. So let's get to the substance now. Who are we? We are an organization of Americans who believe that the strategic relationship between the United States and Egypt is important, and that we will frame and lobby on issues that affect the U.S.-Egypt relationship. Many of you say, well, what does that mean? What issues are you going to talk about? We're going to lobby. We're going to lobby the executive branch, and we're going to lobby the legislative branch. We are going to house the Egyptian American Political Action Committee, which means we will collect monetary donations for U.S. candidates and distribute them. We're also going to serve as an information resource for the media. In other words, when someone from television, radio, or the newspaper wants to talk about Egyptian Americans, we're going to keep a bank of those experts in the area from the Egyptian American community. Many of you, I hope, will be on that speaker's bureau or that speaker's bank. And by virtue of what we do, we not only are going to interact with U.S. officials, we have to and must interact with Egyptian officials if we believe things are going to get done. So in conclusion, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions during the Q&A period, I believe now is the time for us Egyptian Americans to form this organization, this new organization, a lobbying organization which we've never had before. And for those of us who believe that forming this organization for the ground floor is priority number one, I invite all of you to please come join us as a member at the American Egyptian Strategic Alliance. Our website is www.americanegyptiansa.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Randa. I think the energy in the room just exploded.
Yeah.
Thank you for this. It's wonderful to get a flavor of all the different kinds of organizations and what they do. So last but not least, Mr. Khaled.
Thank you, Nihal. And thank you to Ana Masry and Ihab for his tireless efforts, and thank you all also to all my distinguished colleagues on this panel. I want to talk about an effort that I'm involved with called the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association, EARLA, very Anglo-sounding acronym, but obviously we are an Egyptian American organization. So first I'll give you just sort of a quick rundown of who we are and what we do, and then I want to get into why I think it's important. EARLA is, this is sort of the requisite stuff. EARLA is a nonprofit organization comprised of Egyptian American lawyers and policy specialists experienced in legal practice, academia, government, nonprofit, management, grassroots leadership, consulting, and public policy. We are a very diverse group of Egyptian Americans, and in fact, not all of us are actually lawyers. I have the distinction of being the only non-lawyer on the board, so it is an organization that is open to non-practitioners of the legal practice. EARLA also has a very skilled advisory committee that we rely on of experienced legal practitioners. I think this group actually is all lawyers because of the technical nature of our work. Folks like Sherif, whose name has already come up, and other prominent figures, legal practitioners, judges, academics, and others that we rely on for advice, both organizationally and in terms of our programs. So what do we do? EARLA provides legal and technical assistance to the reform community in Egypt. That includes nonprofit organizations, judges, theoretically government, media, anyone who's working in the area of the rule of law. And rule of law really is fundamentally about accountability and transparency. EARLA works to promote these concepts, transparency and accountability, in Egypt, and we do this by partnering. We don't sort of parachute into Egypt and tell everyone what to do. We partner with Egyptians on the ground, activists. They are essentially our counterparts, journalists, lawyers, judges, and others who are working to promote the rule of law. One of our projects is Freedom of Information project. It's our main project right now, which we launched last spring. And we're working on, with a group of, with our Egyptian partners, to promote freedom of information legislation in Egypt. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let me first talk about why I think this is important. And this, I'll be sort of betraying the nerdy side of myself in doing so, because the rule of law doesn't sound very sexy, doesn't sound very interesting. But I think it's actually quite critical. We all know about elections, we all know about sort of the basic functioning of basic institutions like elections, a parliament, a president, a constitution, but all of these are meaningless, really, without the rule of law. The rule of law is what holds it all together, or, in the case of Egypt, doesn't. And I would argue, and this is my own personal opinion of having observed the situation over the last year, is that the rule of law, probably more than any one thing, has deteriorated the most. I see it as really, there's no shortage of freedom of expression. There are clearly challenges when you have censorship in the media and you have state-run media. But there are a lot of voices out there. We've had elections, probably the cleanest elections in Egypt's modern history. We have a plethora of political parties and groupings and coalition, and there's real dynamism. What we have seen an erosion in is very consistently in the rule of law. You have, and I would argue that it's because you have an organization that is running Egypt that is the most non-transparent and unaccountable